Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio.
3.5 years after the Grenfell Tower fire, in which 72 people died, 200,000 high-rise homes in the UK are still wrapped in flammable materials, and up to 1.3 million flats are unmortgageable and therefore virtually impossible to sell. Flat sales have halved, and owners who are leaseholders are being hit with bills for tens of thousands of pounds to replace dangerous cladding on their buildings. The Housing Minister, Christopher Pincher, has promised to bring forward a solution very shortly. Ministers are considering a bailout package which could be worth billions of pounds, but warned this week that there would be no quick fix after Labour forced a debate on the issue. Conservative MPs, meanwhile, have accused the government of incompetence in its handling of the crisis, which has left millions stuck in unsafe homes. 30 MPs have signed an amendment which would bar freeholders from passing the costs of removing cladding or other fire safety work on to leaseholders. But in the meantime, leaseholders are stuck with their flats while facing the burden of huge costs for investigations, patrols of buildings to look out for fires, not to mention the cost of removing dangerous materials. So who should fit the bill, and should the government be doing more? Stephen McPartland is a Conservative MP who's tabled the McPartland-Smith Amendment to Fire Safety Bill. Sarah Rennie is the owner and resident of an apartment in Birmingham. Dr Will Martin is a junior doctor who's worked out it takes 8 weeks' salary from working on a COVID ward to pay his additional service charges. And Martina is senior property writer at the Sunday Times. If I could start with you, perhaps, Dr Will Martin, and you could just describe for me the situation that you find yourself in.
Hi, so my building is in Sheffield, and we are facing bills of £52,000 each for remediation works on the external part of the building. On top of that, we have a £7,000 a week waking watch, which is costing me about £3,000 a year, which, as you said, it's 8 weeks of my yearly salary goes solely on just having someone patrol the building. And this has been now going on for 3.5 years, this battle to make my home safe and to be able to move on with my life. And it's absolutely miserable. The impact it's having on my mental health and all of the leaseholders affected in this is just unimaginable. The feelings that you have going to bed every single night in an unsafe home, you can't communicate that to anyone who isn't living in one of these buildings. And you're a junior doctor working on a COVID ward, so it's not like you're not under a lot of pressure already. Yeah, I was working on the COVID wards when I found out about the waking watch being introduced, and I'd just finished a long shift, and well, yeah, you can imagine my reaction. It's been the most challenging at times, and to come home to find out that we owe such astronomically unimaginable, unaffordable costs leaves me just on the ward so distracted. When I'm at work, I shouldn't be at work thinking about how I'm going to afford the next bill. I should be focusing on my job, and I shouldn't have these worries. And I certainly shouldn't have them 3.5 years on from Grenfell. Absolutely. Martina, later this year, it's going to have been, I mean, Will just mentioned he's been, worrying about this for 3.5 years. It's going to have been 4 years since the Grenfell tragedy. How is it that we're still talking about cladding without having resolved it, and people like Will are in the situation they're in?
Mariella, I think that this is something that the government has not grasped the nettle properly until possibly very recently. It now seems that there's some serious intent to do something. But, it's been 3.5 years and we still don't know how many buildings are dangerous. We still don't know which buildings are dangerous. We still don't know how much it will cost to fix them. All we know is that millions of people are living in dangerous homes, facing these astronomical bills that they can't afford to pay, which they are legally liable for. And they are the only innocent people in this scandal.
And why are leaseholders being asked to foot the bill? And tell me a bit about the impact that that's having on the housing market, though I'd say the impact on individuals is probably even more important.
Yes. Well, under leasehold law, it means that you, as a leaseholder, you don't own the right, you don't own your flat, you don't own your building, but you are liable for the bills to fix it. And the freeholder, who's the real owner of the building, can make you pay legally. So the government has made available some money, £1.6 billion, but that is expected to cover only about 10% of the estimated costs. So, that means leaseholders, unless there's more money from somewhere else, will pay. And it is having a big impact on the housing market. Because of the uncertainty, banks now want proof, and there's new EWS1 safety certificates for just about any flat. And so flat sales have started falling through on really large scales. In September alone last year, flat sales halved compared to the previous September, which is supposed to be the height of the autumn market. And that's £1.6 billion of transactions lost just in 1 month. So, and that's going to knock onto the housing market, because if your first rung is broken, people can't move on to the second rung, and then there's not someone to buy your house and so on and so on. I've just sold my house and we struggled to find a buyer because one of the people who wanted it was in a flat that's affected.
So it's affecting the whole chain, as it were. Stephen, you're a Conservative MP, but you do think that the government has been incompetent in its handling of this. Can you explain your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking listening to the junior doctor. I hear from thousands of leaseholders every week who've got very similar stories, and it's very, very difficult reading them all and also talking to some of them. I think my charge of incompetence comes from back in January 2020, a consolidated advice note was put out by the department, and that moved the goalposts. So up until then, EWS1 forms were required on buildings where they were 18 metres or higher, so basically 6 stories or higher, and that we estimate that affected about 1,700 blocks in the country. Because the minister moved the goalpost, they basically said that it now applied to any building of any height, and that took it to over 100,000 blocks across the country. So we're talking millions of flat owners. I mean, they're talking about up to maybe 4 million flats and all the people who live within them. So it made it a huge, huge issue. And then on top of that, the government doesn't actually know how many blocks of flats are affected or where they all are. I mean, that's the position we're in. So that's where my charge of incompetence comes from.
And of course, the Labour Party are calling for a task force to be set up to investigate, how many buildings, all of the questions that you and Martina have just raised. Is that an initiative that you support?
The problem with a task force is it'd be different if it had some teeth and could do something. But as you said, we're 3.5 years on. And, a lot of this is to do with incompetence around the goalposts haven't moved. I mean, I think with the Labour Party, you're very grateful they're now going to support our amendment. But it's only 200 Labour MPs. We've got 37 Tory MPs who've now signed up to it. And we're continuing to recruit more all the time. So we are making progress. But I think what leaseholders, all they really want to hear is that leaseholders are not going to have to pay. And as I just asked before this show on PMQs, the Prime Minister, I asked him to rule out loans to leaseholders as well. And, he didn't give an answer on that side of it. So we're going to continue pressing.
Because that has been the solution that the government has proffered, hasn't it? Is these long-term loans with very, very low interest rates. But you're still talking about loans of £60,000 that are kind of unimaginably high for most people.
Yeah, I mean, Mario, let me give you 2 examples. The first one is if you think of a block of flats that was done by an affordable housing provider, one of your callers may only own 10% of the flat, and the other 90% may be owned by a social landlord. So effectively, under the current legislation, they're still responsible, the leaseholder, for 100% of those costs, even though they actually only have a mortgage on 10% of the flat. So, instantly, they're just in massive negative equity. They've got nowhere to go. The flat's worthless. Then if you then look at, somebody who's actually just bought a flat off the market outright, well, if you're building society or a bank, you actually have to, when you're giving a mortgage, you have to demonstrate that, one, it's structurally sound and safe, and two, it's affordable. So on the structurally sound and safe, if the flat hasn't had its EWS1 form or whatever else done to it, the mortgage provider can't actually allow somebody to buy that property because they can't offer them a mortgage on it. And then secondly, in terms of the affordability, if you've got a 90% mortgage on that flat, and say, just because the maths is easier, the flat's worth £200,000, well then, effectively that's £180,000 mortgage set. Well, if you then get hit with a £60,000 maintenance bill on top of that, you're in negative equity of £50,000. So the building society and the bank, they're not actually allowed to give you the mortgage under the current legislation. So what we've actually gone and done is, if we do leaseholders loans to pay for this, we're going to effectively mean that we're going to push millions of people into negative equity and entrench the fact that these leaseholders cannot sell their properties.
Yeah, and a terrifying thought at a time when, money is not, we're not awash in money anyway. Sarah, you live in an apartment which you own. What's your situation?
I live in a block in Birmingham, and I moved in 2008. After I graduated, I was looking for an accessible flat because I'm a wheelchair user. So I found somewhere that was perfect for me. I had easy access to transport links, could get around into the city centre, access shops and so on. So I adapted it, put in a wet room, a specialist toilet, ceiling hoist, something for my carers to safely support me to live independently. And that was meant to be my home for life. It is my home for life. Like many pensioners and a lot of people, we don't actually plan, some of us, on moving. And now I'm facing these bills, and I'm also finding out that a building I thought was safe isn't safe, and now I'm facing quite frightening evacuation situations.
Yeah, that's a point that Will raised as well, that I'm not sure we talk about often enough, which is that both of you, along with the financial fears, which are huge, you're also afraid sleeping in your own homes at night. Is that how you describe it, Sarah?
Yes, it is, and from the people that support me to live there. When I moved in, it was a safe building. I felt very safe, and everybody had a plan for me that was just stay put if there's a fire. Now we know the building is not safe. It's covered in flammable cladding. We all saw what happened at Grenfell on that terrible night and how fast it spread. So we have to evacuate immediately wherever it is in the building. So I have to get down 13 flights of stairs, and I can't walk or stand. So we use an evacuation chair, which my residence board kind of got me very recently and swiftly. But it is terrifying, and a lot of disabled leaseholders and people with access needs as well are finding that the physical and mental health impacts exacerbating existing conditions. It's very frightening.
Well, how big is fear a factor for you as well? I mean, alongside the financial worries?
Massively. You cannot measure how much fear I have when I'm in that building about my safety and about other leaseholders in the building. The points that Sarah's just been making about anxiety and worries around it have been evidenced. 9 out of 10 people saying that their mental health has deteriorated because of this situation. 23% of people saying that they feel suicidal or want to self-harm. 7 out of 10 saying that they can't sleep at night. The evidence is there. Everyone knows that this is having a huge impact on mental health alone. Forgetting the financial impact, just the mental health impact of living in one of these buildings. And I really think it's terrible that all this time after Grenfell, we're still in this situation where we don't have a plan, and it's just forcing so many people into misery. We get a lot of people reach out to the campaign saying that they have had suicidal feelings or want to take their lives, and it's awful hearing those thoughts. And the government can do more and should be doing more, and they've dragged their heels on it until now.
Martina, who's at fault originally for using this cladding in the first place?
Mariella, it's a combination. What Grenfell has exposed is basically decades of shoddy construction, B, rules that were weakened by the government, and C, a poor inspection regime. So the only people that are not at fault are the leaseholders. So it's the people who made the rules, who built the buildings, who inspected them. All of them play a part, and I think all of them should be helping to pay for this.
Will, no, actually, Sarah, let me ask you first. This idea that the government mooted until recently, they may be changing their agenda on it now, but the idea of giving you loans to pay so that you can pay these service bills, which you then repay, how does that play out for you?
Well, I have a condition that over time I'm not going to be able to work as hard as I currently am, and I was hoping to already be part-time by now. I paid off my mortgage. I really focused hard and with the help of my family to do that. And now I'm back up to 6 days a week working to pay for this. The idea that I'm going to have loans into the future, I didn't plan for that, even though I was exceptionally financially responsible in looking to my future to live independently and comfortably. So it's totally unacceptable. I did not sign up for a loan when I took on a flat. You know, I understand if you make an agreement, and I didn't in this case. You can't impose loans on people. That's not fair. That's not a bargain.
Mm. And Will, what about you?
I would echo those and a few other things to add, mainly what McPartland said just there about the fact that, you know, the whole point of if loans are being offered to leaseholders to get the market moving again, I question how that is going to get the market moving, because no one is going to want to buy my flat that's got a £52,000 loan attached to it, which will come with interest and probably will look at something like £78,000 over the course of 60 years if it's at 1.5%. So it's not going to speed things. It's not going to actually make the market open again. It goes against everything that the government has said for the last 3 years. And it's not going after the person who created these problems. I think that the people who created these problems should be held to account. We're not necessarily asking for taxpayers to solve the problem. We're asking for the builders who have got billions of pounds worth of profit every single year, who made these mistakes, to face real force, because we shouldn't be made to pay for these things.
We're discussing the cladding scandal, which has left hundreds of thousands of leaseholders in flats they can't sell and facing huge bills for remedial work. My guests are Stephen McPartland, Conservative MP, who's tabled the McPartland-Smith Amendment to the Fire Safety Bill; Sarah Rennie, who owns and lives in an apartment in Birmingham; Dr. Will Martin, a junior doctor who's worked out it takes 8 weeks' salary from working on a COVID ward to pay his additional service charges; and Martina, who's senior property writer at the Sunday Times. I've had a message in, Stephen, that might interest you from someone in the fire industry. It says, I'm in the fire industry and involved with the cladding issue. I feel so sorry for those tenants, leaseholders, having to pay for a waking watch through their service charge, in many cases, I believe, unnecessarily. The government guidance is so heavy-handed. While I'm sure there are some blocks with cladding similar to that used on Grenfell Tower, many blocks have minor cladding or external wall defects with very little risk of a fire spreading up the outside. But because the guidance classes these as a failure, they're required to have a very expensive waking watch until there is a fire alarm installed. The government should have a closer look at the guidance they've issued and have it amended to address the problem in a risk-based, progressive way, rather than a one-size-fits-all, which really plays to what you were saying earlier, doesn't it, Stephen?
Oh, very much so, Mariella. I mean, I completely agree with your listener. It really is around incompetence on some of the guidance. I mean, you've effectively got people who may be in a 2-story block of flats and they may have a wooden balcony, and they're being treated exactly the same as somebody who lived on the top floor of a tower like Grenfell. And, the risk is completely different. On top of this, under the current legislation, it astonishes me, but there's actually no reason, the government's not prohibiting buildings under 18 metres actually being built at the moment on having combustible cladding. So as we speak today, somebody could be putting ACM cladding up, or a version of it, on a building, anywhere right now. And the definition of cladding range is so wide. It ranges from, those dangerous materials all the way across to wood. And, although wood is technically flammable, a wooden balcony is far less risk than a building that's, completely clad. But on top of that, in my area, cladding's not just the issue. A lot of it's around fire safety defects, and that's where the waking watchers come in. So, there are buildings where the cladding's completely safe, but when they've lifted it, they've seen they're actually underneath. The work's not being done properly, and it's just being signed off, and it's not being done correctly. And that's where the fire services have a big difficulty, because if there isn't the correct compartmentalisation or other bits and pieces, they need to be confident that they can get those people out safely. So a lot of it is around fire safety defects. It's not just cladding.
Stephen, you're a member of the party that's in government. I mean, it beggars belief that this hasn't been sorted out. I'm just listening to you, and I just can't understand why we're in the situation we're in. What's preventing sensible action being taken?
I think it's just too hard. I mean, as one of your other panelists said earlier, this has gone on for decades. So you've got to unwind decades and decades worth of problems. And that's a huge issue for any government. And I think with the cladding and fire safety issues, we do need competence. We need people to actually sit down. I've got a meeting shortly with Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue to talk about one of my buildings, and you do need those type of discussions. What is the actual risk? How can we work together with the leaseholders inside those buildings to ensure that they're safe? What is it that they can do to make their buildings effective and moving forward? And as the government continues to move the goalposts, it's not really the government, it's the department. As they continue to move those goalposts, it's just incredibly difficult for leaseholders. And many of the people who are worried today about how dangerous their buildings are, when the tests are done, they won't have been dangerous at all. They will have been okay, but those people will have had years of severe mental trauma, so to speak, because they're laying their head down at night, fearing they're in danger and their family is. So, the government needs to get a grip on it. And, as myself and my colleague, the member, Royston Smith, member for Southampton Itchen, have said, we're very happy to work with them and the leaseholders to get this done. The leaseholders know what needs to be done. They're living in these buildings. They have the expertise.
But it does sound to me like this is something that really does need cross-party engagement, full cross-party engagement, because what you're suggesting with your amendment and what the Labour Party is suggesting with their task force seem to be two things that need to work hand in hand, because one without the other won't necessarily solve the issue. And then, of course, there's the government's, proposing of this loan system, where you've heard Will and Sarah's thoughts on it. I'd love to hear yours.
So, I mean, I've been very clear. I just asked the Prime Minister, as I say, in PMQs to rule out loans to leaseholders. They're not a solution. And I don't want loans going to freeholders and then those freeholders passing the bills on to leaseholders, which the Fire Safety Bill would allow them to do in its current form. So what our amendment does is it basically makes it law that leaseholders are not liable for any historic fire safety defects, and that would protect them from the majority of these bills. In terms of cross-party support, I'm always happy to work with anybody. The reality is that, you need everybody to work together to actually deliver a solution. My only hesitation on a task force is that just, I wouldn't want something to be a talking shop. It needs to be something that allows us to deal with this. And as I said, as your listener said, we could deal with a lot of this by actually looking at the guidance and resolving some of the issues within the guidance, identifying where a lot of the buildings are, and then working with the local fire and rescue authorities to actually go out there and deliver hope for these leaseholders. And, with the leaseholders, they really are the only innocent party. I mean, you've got freeholders, and there are some great freeholders out there, and there are some very difficult freeholders out there. It's not an industry that's regulated. You've got the insurance industry. They've got massive premiums on some of these buildings that require a waking watch. And, effectively, building insurance should be paying for some of this. You've got the developers who've done it. They should be paying for some of this. So there's a huge number of people who could actually be involved in the solution. But it is going to take government money up front to get this done at pace. Because if we're talking about, well over 100,000 plus buildings and we don't actually know where they all are, there's a piece of work that needs to be done very quickly to actually move forward at pace and help these leaseholders.
Martina, the Sunday Times is the first national newspaper to campaign on this topic, and it's an issue that you've been investigating and reporting on. I think Stephen's laid out how complicated it is to resolve, but what do you think the steps are that need to be taken immediately?
Mariella, I think the first thing that needs to be done is the government needs to have a government body that's responsible for finding out which buildings are dangerous and inspecting them. At the moment, councils are being asked to collect data from managing agents on buildings in their areas, and we still don't know the scale of the picture. First, we need to know the size of the problem. And have some independent assessment. We also need the government to look at how to fund this in a better way, not through loans, but, they haven't talked about making developers pay. Just the 5 biggest house builders, just since Grenfell, have posted over £10 billion in profits. All of them have schemes that have fire risks. So by bringing in a levy, a blanket levy on which I can consult with the industry, as I did on banks after the financial crisis, that would go a long way. There's a very clever proposal that a charity called Leasehold Knowledge Partnership has put together with the Bank of England economists that sets up a funding structure which will borrow money from pension funds and then pay the interest using money including from developers, and so that money can then go to fix the buildings straight away upfront, and the developers and insurers and other mechanisms can fund that over time. So the loans proposal that we've talked about, the scheme is similar, but it is paid for by the leaseholders. But why not get the industry to fund that long-running costs? But we get the money up front and we get those buildings fixed.
Will, what do you feel about what Stephen said about these properties not only still standing covered in flammable cladding, but that they're actually still being built?
It's disgraceful. It really is. I mean, to think that any building post-Grenfell could be built with the materials that we saw were so hazardous on that night, it's disgusting. It's terrible.
And Sarah, I mean, ultimately, how has it made you feel about this home for life that you adapted absolutely to comply with your needs, and now you spend every night lying awake worrying about?
Well, I still love my flat, and I want it to be made safe. I'm just astonished by the lack of urgency, not just the safety, but the financial side. We're seeing flats that blocks paying £45,000 in a month between the government announcing the Waking Watch Fund in December, and when it surprisingly on Sunday afternoon and that released the application form for the fund, that £45,000, that 1 month was spent on one block. There is no sense of urgency. I understand it's complex and the government is trying to please every stakeholder in finding a solution. But in the meantime, this is dangerous and it's bankrupting people.
And just,
going off the back of that's the point, and the crux of this matter is that it is not going to be the remediation costs to fix these buildings that bankrupt people. It's not those costs. It's the interim costs, the Waking Watch costs, the insurance hikes of over 1,000%. They're the costs. They're the costs that are going to cause people to go bankrupt. They're the costs that are going to cause people to commit suicide. And we need immediate action on those. The government has made some steps with the Waking Watch Fund that's just been mentioned by Sarah there, but it's, again, misses the mark by so much. It's not going to cover all of the buildings with Waking Watchers on. It doesn't cover buildings with under 18 metres. There's so little sense of urgency from government that this problem is causing leaseholders this massive heartache and needs addressing immediately.
Just finally, Will, how confident are you that you are going to get to focus on your COVID ward work and not spend your nights worrying about the finances and whether or not your home is going to go up in flames?
Well, if it's anything like the last 3.5 years, I'm not confident, but I do like to think of myself as a little bit of an optimist. And I'm hopeful that with the coming budget, that something is going to be announced that is going to help leaseholders, all leaseholders, and end this mess. We need a commitment from government that the costs are not going to be passed on to leaseholders. And the way that MPs can do that is by supporting McPartland's amendment.
Dr. Will Martin, Martina Lees, Sarah Rennie and Stephen McPartland MP, thank you all very much for joining me.
Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio.